Good evening and welcome to Crossroads. The United Nations General Assembly is bringing together world leaders in an opportunity to address the threats they face. During yesterday's speeches, many spoke about the adversaries of the free world. Among the anticipated speeches was from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And when he took the podium, the embattled leader who has turned to the world for aid spoke about the threats he believes his nation faces. Climate change. Watch.
Even though humanity is failing on its climate policy objectives, this means that extreme weather will still impact the normal global life, and some evil state will also weaponize its outcomes. And when people in the streets of New York and other cities of the world went out on climate protest, we all have seen them. And when people in Morocco and Libya and other countries die as a result of natural disasters, and when islands and countries disappear underwater, and when tornadoes and deserts are spreading into new territories, and when all of this is happening, one unnatural disaster in Moscow decided to launch a big war and kill tens of thousands of people.
A natural disaster in Moscow. Many commentators online were quick to question what Zelensky was talking about. Most people thought he'd be talking about Russia and asking for more aid in the fight against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Why is he talking about climate change, and how is he trying to link the alleged threat of climate change with Russia? Well, to understand this, we need to unravel some history. You see, support for Ukraine started off pretty high globally. When Russia invaded the country in February 2022, the United States and a good part of Europe stood behind Ukraine. That support started to fade, however. In Europe, the war is blamed for soaring energy prices. They need Russian energy since, as President Trump warned Europe before about this, Russia has a monopoly on the energy infrastructure in the region. This was only made worse with the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. And of course, in the United States, the Ukraine war is turning into a partisan political issue. While some Republicans, like Mike Pence, stand behind the war, many others criticize the current administration for runaway spending on Ukrainian aid, when the U.S. is facing notably financial problems of its own. But on the Democrat side, and among many of the leftist countries throughout the world, the Ukraine war represents something else. While many of them appear to generally stand by Ukraine, the war derailed some of their key agendas on climate change. They blame Russia for throwing a wrench into their plans. They're mad at Ukraine for not pushing hard enough towards victory. The ongoing war is eating into the agendas that many on their side of the political aisle demand. To understand this, we need to go back to 2021. The war had not yet started. President Biden had only recently taken over the White House. It appeared that Trump was pushed off the political stage, never to come back again, and the world was looking to build back better from the COVID emergency. Shortly after Biden came into office, one of his first moves was an executive order on climate change. In January 2021, he issued an order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad.
It's about coming to the moment to deal with this maximum threat that that's now facing us, climate change, with a greater sense of urgency. In my view, we've already waited too long to deal with this climate crisis. We can't wait any longer. That's why I'm signing today an executive order to supercharge our administration's ambitious plan to confront the existential threat of climate change. It is an existential threat. And just like we need a unified national response to COVID-19, we desperately need a unified national response to the climate crisis, because there is a climate crisis.
Now, that's set into motion a whole of government system that could remake America and the world in the image of the agenda around climate change. It put the so-called climate crisis at the center of United States foreign policy and national security. Biden also stated in the order that, quote, "Together we must listen to science and meet the moment." This did many things. Among them was to create a special presidential envoy for climate, and similar ones like it, in fact. In the White House, there was also a new Office of Domestic Climate Policy that would run within the executive office of the president. It would let the office directly coordinate and monitor the agenda and its progress. And this was no minor initiative. It included, on that task force, leading members of Biden's cabinet. This is the Secretary of Defense, Treasury, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Homeland Security, Energy, and many others too long to list. Among the others, though, the Attorney General and also the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. And again, the list goes on. Now, some may wonder what climate change has to do with the Department of Defense. How is this a military issue? Why is the Department of Homeland Security involved? Wasn't that made to fight terrorists? What about the Treasury or Housing or just about every other branch of our government for that matter? The executive order states that the task force shall facilitate the organization and development of a government-wide approach to combat the climate crisis. And apparently that involved just about everything, encompassing the entire nation and even including state, local, tribal, and territorial governments. Not to mention the global agenda tied in with it. Foreign agreements, things like the Paris Accord, for example. And even this was just a small picture of how broad all of this was. Now, another piece of it was a new initiative for the American people. It was the Civilian Conservation Corps. The establishment media framed this as a kind of revival of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It was touted as a jobs program, a way to get American citizens out in the workforce. Fast Company wrote that it would look different from the original Civilian Conservation Corps, the program that sent Americans to live in workers' camps. The problem with the old one is that it only hired men, and as Fast Company states, the camps were racially segregated. It also only paid them around $30 a month. But this time, under Biden's revived program, it said they'll be making a living wage, around $15 an hour. Now, Grist framed as a type of carrying out of the spirit of the Green New Deal that was Representative AOC's climate proposal that aimed to essentially tear down and remake all of America. It wrote this: Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York had reportedly sold Secretary of State John Kerry on the idea of a climate corps. The resemblance to the New Deal program, it even has the same acronym, CCC, may explain why the proposal sounds like part of a Green New Deal. Now, it framed the programs as being all about jobs and justice and using these to carry out the climate agenda. Now, it was all on track. It looked like soon the whole world would be following this new model. The workers' paradise seemed within reach. And then something happened that shattered their dreams. Russia invaded Ukraine. And when that happened, it also derailed the climate agenda. AP News, in fact, ran the headline in 2022 that, quote, Ukraine war upends Biden's agenda on energy, climate change. And it noted that Biden was forced to rein in rising energy costs even if those moves run counter to his agenda for addressing climate change. He released millions of barrels of oil from the U.S. strategic reserves in order to stop gas prices from skyrocketing even worse than they have. Bloomberg noted that releasing of energy crude oil wasn't just about fighting off high prices, it was about optics during an election year. Now, make quality of life too poor and you might lose some votes. Stay tuned after the break. We'll go deeper into how the war in Ukraine was transformed into a war against climate change. Welcome back. We were just talking about how a global agenda was set in motion to fight climate change by President Biden, and how the war in Ukraine was described as derailing the climate agenda earlier this last year. And of course, things only got worse after the war started. The anger of all this was palpable in public speeches. Russia wasn't just being blamed for invading Ukraine and launching a war. It was being blamed for damaging the global agenda on climate change, rising food costs, the energy crisis, quality of life for the average citizen was being hit. In some ways, the climate agenda would have hit these anyway, but the war increased the pressure a little too quickly, and it made the climate policies cut a lot deeper into people's the basic livelihoods than may be intended. Now, even if the United States and Biden stood by Ukraine amidst all this, many European countries began backing off. And this also meant they were backing off the climate agenda. PBS reported in 2022 that Germany's climate envoy, Jennifer Morgan, acknowledged that the Russian war of aggression is forcing us to take short-term decisions we don't like, including the increased use of coal for a very limited period of time. So facing this, what was the next step? Well, the establishment media pivoted the narrative. The war in Ukraine was no longer just about a war. Tanks and bombs were no longer just threats to human life. It was transformed into a climate war. Focus was shifted from human impact to the carbon footprint of missiles. Fighting the war in Ukraine was transformed into a fight against the climate emergency. Take this piece from Politico, for example. Earlier this month, it proclaimed this: there's a battle over carbon emerging from the war in Ukraine. It talked about the impact the war is having on climate change and to calculate the carbon emissions of a war. It noted that the Paris Climate Agreement, for example, requires nations to disclose their national carbon emissions. But what about military emissions? It says this: direct and indirect emissions of militaries might account for 5.5% of total global emissions, according to estimates by scientists for Global Responsibility and the Conflict and Environment Observatory, two UK-based nonprofits. It says that's nearly as much as the annual emissions of the world's entire fleet of passenger cars. Time magazine ran a similar piece, and it laid out a different angle. To defeat Russia, we don't just need to defeat them militarily. To defeat Russia, we need to defeat climate change. It quoted a Ukrainian meteorologist who stated, the money that is funding this aggression comes from the same place as climate change does: fossil fuels. If we didn't depend on fossil fuels, Russia would not have the money to make this aggression. Time also quoted a Ukrainian lawmaker who stated, every barrel of Russian oil and every cubic meter of Russian gas is now full of the blood of Ukrainians. So are you getting that? The war in Ukraine has now been connected to the war against climate change. That whole of government fight against climate change, the Paris Accord, global agreements to fight climate change that many countries have signed on to, all of that would now necessitate victory against carbon emissions and Russia, the things that are causing the crisis, they say. And the narratives have now been linked to Russia directly on this. The war itself is now a climate war. Now, take that and you might understand why US aid to Ukraine seems to be shifting as well. We're no longer just financing a war against Russia. We are financing a climate program tied in with Ukraine's economy and their energy sector. In fact, just recently on September 14th, Biden announced a new special representative specifically to head a program for Ukraine's economic recovery. Understand this, and you might also understand why Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced just recently that America would be giving an aid package to Ukraine, not to help it fight the war, but instead to help it build clean energy infrastructure. Watch.
At the Ukraine Recovery Conference held in London a few months ago, I pledged that the United States would invest more than $520 million in making Ukraine's energy infrastructure, more than half of which has been destroyed by Russia, cleaner, more resilient, and more integrated with Europe.
Now, take this as a whole, and Zelensky's recent speech with the United Nations may also make some more sense. It's an issue of narrative, a new way to frame a war in line with an agenda. Well, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and as always, stay informed and stay free.